Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can check out any updates to our forecasts or what watches, warnings, and advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391, getting updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. We don't have any watches, warnings, or advisories out for today, so we will jump ahead to our satellite imagery. We'll start off with a low pressure system moving up towards the central Aleutian Islands. As we watch this, we can see quite a bit of cloud cover moving through the Aleutians into the Bering Sea, bringing some precipitation to those areas. Then out ahead of this, that front starting to push in some cloud cover out over much of southwest Alaska. Watching this loop again, we can see another low moving into the western portions of the Bering Sea, bringing some cloud cover to those areas. And then we can watch a wave moving through the northern portions of the Gulf, bringing some cloud cover near to the North Gulf Coast. As we look at our precip for the remainder of the day, we can see that troughing moving through the Gulf of Alaska, bringing up quite a bit of warmer air with that southerly flow, bringing in some rain all along the North Gulf Coast to include Kodiak Island and down into southeast part of the state. As we get a little bit further to the north in the Panhandle area, we will see a mix of rain and snow, where we have a lot of snow at higher elevations and areas further to the north. That's going to be true in south central as well. Some of the higher elevation areas will see primarily snow, but we are getting a lot of the warmer air starting to push in along the coastlines. As we move up further into the state, we do have some areas of showers stuck under that high pressure, where we will see a mix of rain and snow into southern portions of the interior and down in portions of southwest Alaska as well. But as we move up further to the north, starting to see primarily snow, and that's going to be true out in western portions of the interior as well. Then up through the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline, we are expecting to see some snow. Down in the Aleutian Islands area, we do have a system approaching from the North Pacific, also bringing up a lot of warm air with this one. And we are going to see that rain spreading to areas of the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. The mix of rain and snow expected for the central Aleutians. That precipitation at this time not quite making it to the Pribilof Islands yet. And we will also see a mix of rain and snow from another low out by the western Aleutians. As we then look into tonight, that frontal system that was near the Aleutians pushing well into the Bering Sea now and starting to make its way to southwest Alaska. We are seeing the push of warmer air coming in, bringing rain to southwest Alaska coastline and also some rain to the Alaska Peninsula and central Aleutians. We do have the area of low pressure lingering out by the western Aleutians, bringing some showers to the area out there. Much of mainland Alaska is going to clear from the precipitation as those waves moving through are exiting out to the east, but there will still be some isolated showers in northeastern portions of the state. However, the high pressure is going to keep things at bay for much of south central Alaska tonight. We do have that other wave moving through the Gulf of Alaska, bringing in more rain to the Panhandle area, where we will see rain extending throughout all the area, keeping things warm enough to see rain at most locations. Then as we move into Tuesday, rain will start to clear up in the Panhandle with just some isolated showers around, especially out in southern locations and out by the Yakutat area. Continuing to see southerly flow over south central Alaska, bringing rain to the coastline and areas of the Alaska Peninsula and then down in Kodiak Island. But more interior locations of south central will clear up here on Tuesday. And that's going to be true for much of the interior, for central and eastern interior, and up through the Brooks Range and the Arctic coastline. As we look down the west coast of this state, our old frontal system continuing to push into the western portions of the state, bringing a rain and snow mix to areas of the Seward Peninsula, for St. Lawrence Island, and much of the YK Delta. Still warmer further to the south in the Bristol Bay area, where we are expecting to see rain, and that rain is going to extend down into the Alaska Peninsula. Our other low is moving out through the southern portions of the Bering, bringing some lighter rain to areas around the central Aleutians and out by the western Aleutians, with another system headed that way. As we move into Wednesday, we can see that next system coming up from the North Pacific, another round of warm air coming towards the Aleutian Islands, starting to bring precipitation to the central and western Aleutians on Wednesday. And as we progress through the day, expecting more of that rain to make it to the area. We have another low in the northern part of the Bering Sea with some troughing pushing through the eastern portions of the Bering. Areas further to the north, such as St. Lawrence Island, going to see primarily snow, but the Pribilof Islands and areas further to the south, such as the eastern Aleutians, going to see primarily rain. Some rain showers will also be expected under the southerly flow for the Alaska Peninsula, and that's going to be primarily on the Pacific side of the peninsula. Then our other front slowly moving through the interior portions of the state, making it into the western interior where we'll see some snow for Galena and areas along the west coast up to the northwest coastline down through much of the Seward Peninsula. Rain and snow mix for the YK Delta area, and then rain for Bristol Bay. And the warm front with this warmer flow coming up from the south, pushing rain well into south central Alaska, with some areas of mix of rain and snows get to more interior locations. Then down in the Panhandle area, we are expecting to see isolated snow showers, especially in the central and northern locations, with some heavier rain for the Yakutat area. Taking a look at our temperatures for Tuesday morning, staying down in southeastern part of the state, we are looking at temperatures dropping to right around 40 degrees, a little bit warmer in more southern locations. Let's move to south central Alaska, temperatures dropping into the lower 30s for areas nearest to the water, and then as we move to more interior locations, dropping down into the 20s, with 22 expected low for Glen Allen. And then as we move up into the interior, we can see temperatures dropping down into the 20s for most locations, a little bit warmer as we push more to the southwest. Galena getting down to 27 degrees, McGrath down to 26, then in the 30s for much of southwest Alaska, with some colder temperatures in the YK Delta area, right around freezing there, with Macoriac down to 28. Pushing up the coastline, we do have temperatures in the Seward Peninsula area dropping down into the 20s, lower 20s for the Kotzebue Sound area, and then into the teens and single digits along the Arctic coastline, with Wainwright dropping down to 7 degrees. As we look down into the Alaska Peninsula, dropping down to right around 40 degrees, in the upper 30s for much of the Aleutian Islands, with 32 degrees expected low for St. Paul. Highs in the afternoon on Tuesday, we are looking at temperatures getting back into the mid to upper 40s for much of the Aleutian Islands, right around 50 degrees for the Bristol Bay area, and then into the upper 30s to mid 40s for the YK Delta, mid 30s for much of the Norton Sound area and Kotzebue Sound area, then into the upper teens for much of the Arctic coastline, with some areas getting into the 20s, into the 40s for much of the interior, with Fairbanks getting the warmest at 55 degrees expected high, and then the mid to upper 40s for south central Alaska, 49 for Kodiak, and then upper 40s to right around 50 degrees for the Panhandle. Wednesday morning dropping down back into the lower 40s to upper 30s for the Panhandle area, down to the mid 30s for south central Alaska, right around 30 to the lower 30s for areas in the interior, and then up in the Arctic coastline dropping down into the lower teens to some areas in the single digits, right around 30 degrees for the Kotzebue Sound area, and then the mid 30s for much of the west coast down through the YK Delta, and then upper 30s for the Bristol Bay area, right around 40 for the Alaska Peninsula, and in the mid to upper 30s for the Aleutian Islands. Wednesday afternoon highs getting up into the mid 40s for the Aleutians, with the mid to upper 40s for the Bristol Bay area, King Salmon up to 49 degrees, lower 40s for the YK Delta, in the mid to upper 30s for all places around the Seward Peninsula, into the upper 20s to low 30s for the Arctic coastline, mid 40s to lower 50s for the interior, warmest to the east, mid 40s to low 50s for south central, again warmer in the east, right around 50 degrees to the lower 50s for the Panhandle area.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a quick look at our flying weather on Tuesday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are expected, with those IFR conditions also making their way into southwest Alaska and through much of the Norton Sound. So look up further to the northern portions of the interior, Kotzebue Sound area, and Arctic coast, and all expecting to see MVFR conditions with some occasional IFR conditions. Down in south central Alaska, primarily VFR, but there are some marginal and IFR conditions approaching from the south. And then down in the Panhandle, we are expecting widespread IFR conditions in the morning. However, as we move to Tuesday afternoon, those conditions are going to clear up, become much more marginal, and northern locations even seeing some areas of VFR. South central Alaska, Tuesday afternoon, we are seeing a mix of MVFR and VFR conditions, with the interior part of the state seeing primarily VFR conditions, and some isolated areas of MVFR as we move up along the Arctic coastline. Down the west coast coast of the state, primarily IFR conditions are expected. Bristol Bay area cleaning up a little bit, getting to some marginal conditions, and then widespread IFR throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Wednesday morning, expecting widespread IFR conditions to remain out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians and much of the west coast as well, with some of those areas of IFR extending now into portions of the central part of the interior and some areas of south central Alaska. Down in the Panhandle, expecting MVFR and IFR conditions, with some of those MVFR conditions better up further to the north. And all the way along the Arctic coastline, a mix of VFR and MVFR conditions are expected. Then in Wednesday afternoon, jumping down to southeastern portion of the state, primarily MVFR conditions, but quite a bit of IFR out over the Gulf that is pushing in towards the Panhandle area. For south central Alaska, a mix of MVFR and IFR conditions are expected, and in the interior, western areas are going to see primarily IFR, with conditions improving as we move further to the east, where VFR conditions are expected in the eastern interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, a mix of MVFR and IFR is expected, and then IFR all the way down the west coast of the state, and for much of the Bering and Aleutians as well. Taking a look through the passes, starting up north, AKwx Pass, start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Adigan Pass also going to start off IFR and then improve to marginal in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be marginal conditions throughout the day on Tuesday. Rainy Pass should be VFR throughout the day, as well as at Windy Pass. Isabel Pass also expected to be VFR. Mentasta Pass going to start marginal and then improve to VFR in the afternoon. Dehne Pass will start off VFR and drop down to marginal conditions later in the day, as well as at Portage. Joku and White will both start off IFR and then improve to VFR in the afternoon. Taking a look at our freezing levels, freezing line starts off north of the Panhandle area and then rides through south central Alaska and through southwest Alaska and out through much of the northern part of the Bering Sea. A lot of warm air coming up from the south. We're seeing quite a bit of the higher freezing levels moving in, especially over in the Gulf area, where we even have a 10,000 foot freezing level just to the south of the Panhandle, and our 2,000 foot freezing level moves through much of the interior part of the state and out through central portions of the Bering. Our icing expected for Tuesday along the west coast of the state, above 7,000 feet around the Seward Peninsula, and then above 8,000 feet as we get closer towards the Bristol Bay area. Out over the northern portions of the state, below 3,000 feet is expected. As we look at our jet for Tuesday, we do have the strongest portion of the jet just south of the central Aleutian Islands, 130 to 140 knots out of a westerly direction. A little bit weaker as it makes it over the islands, only around 100 knots there. Over the west coast of the state, we are also experiencing a southerly component of the jet getting as high as 100 knots out over the YK Delta area. A little bit weaker further to the south, but still southerly direction over the Alaska Peninsula, around 75 knots. Another stronger portion of the jet out over the Arctic coastline and 95 knots out of the west. Then down over the Panhandle area, expecting the jet to be somewhere around 75 knots. 9,000 foot winds, we will stay over the southeast westerly direction, 45 to 60 knots, increasing as we move further to the east. Out over the Arctic coastline, westerly winds 30 knots. And then out over the west coast of the state, southerly winds 30 to 45 knots, strongest near St. Lawrence Island, and some weaker flow out over the central and western Aleutians. For 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow, southerly winds out over the west coast of the state, getting up to as high as 45 knots near the Norton Sound area, 35 knots over the Bristol Bay area, and 40 knots as we move out over the southern part of the Bering Sea. Much of the rest of mainland Alaska will have some weaker winds, and then over southeast we are expecting westerly winds at 30 knots. For turbulence over the Panhandle area, below 6,000 feet is expected. On much of the west coast with some of those stronger winds below 3,000 feet up by the Seward Peninsula and below 4,000 feet by the Bristol Bay area. And we're also expecting some turbulence over the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. Below 3,000 feet is expected there for Tuesday.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse, we're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The Western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles in nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll start off in southeast Alaska with Tuesday's forecast. In the inside waters, we're expecting northwest winds 5 to 10 knots, becoming more easterly further to the south. Out over the Gulf and southern areas, we are looking at westerly winds around 10 knots, becoming more southerly as we move further to the north and getting up to as high as 15 knots out of the east. For Wednesday, we are looking in the inside waters, primarily southeasterly winds 5 to 10 knots, but as we get further to the south, becoming northwesterly around 10 knots. Out over the Gulf and southern areas, northwest winds 15 knots, shifting around to become more west and then eventually south, still at 10 knots as we move further to the north, and southeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots up in the northern portions of the Gulf. As we look out over south central Alaska on Tuesday, westerly winds out over the Gulf, weakest up north, 15 knots expected there, getting up to as high as 35 knots as we get closer towards the Barren Islands. And in Prince William Sound, northeast winds 10 knots. Cook Inlet is going to see northerly winds 10 to 20 knots, highest further to the south, and then getting up to northeast winds 25 knots west of the Barren Islands. Then on Wednesday, staying in Cook Inlet area, northeasterly winds 15 to 20 knots, getting up to as high as 35 knots out of the east for areas west of the Barren Islands, seas as high as 10 feet. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, east of the Barrens, we're going to see winds 30 knots out of a southeasterly direction, continuing the southeast direction, but dropping down to 15 to 20 for northern portions of the Gulf. Then in Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 15 knots are expected. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, we're seeing primarily southeasterly winds for all locations, 15 to 20 knots, a little bit stronger in Bristol Bay at 25 knots, and then northeasterly winds in Shelikof Strait at 25 knots, seas up to as high as 9 feet, highest on the Pacific side. On Wednesday, flows still somewhat southerly to southeasterly, looking at 25 knots in eastern locations, dropping down to 15 to 20 as we get further to the west. And then in Shelikof Strait, easterly winds 20 knots are expected. Seas as high as 11 feet, highest on the Pacific side. For the Aleutian Islands, starting out in the east, southeasterly winds 15 to 20 knots on the Pacific side, 25 knots on the Bering side. For the Central Aleutian, southerly winds 20 knots. And then we're going to have switching winds to northwesterly direction as we get near Adak out at 15 knots, and then becoming southeasterly by the western Aleutians, 15 knots expected there. Seas as high as 13 feet, highest on the Pacific side. As we move into Wednesday, staying out in the western Aleutians, easterly winds 30 knots are expected with seas at 12 feet. Then as we move back over the central Aleutians, southeasterly winds 20 to 30 knots, strongest on the Pacific side, and then southerly winds by the eastern Aleutians around 20 knots. For the west coast, winds out of a southeast to east direction, around 30 knots along the coastline, diminishing as we get away from the coast, down to 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Seas around 6 to 7 feet. Wednesday, staying out of a southeast to southerly direction, we are seeing winds along the coast now at 15 knots, getting stronger as we get away from the coastline at 20 knots out of a southeasterly direction. Up along the Arctic coastline, westerly winds 15 knots are expected, and then down the west coast of the state, easterly winds 15 knots up north, getting up to as high as 25 knots as we approach the Bering Strait. Then on Wednesday, southerly winds along the west coast, 15 to 25 knots, strongest as we get further to the north, and then along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds 25 knots are expected. For tonight's weather, we have a low pressure system and frontal system associated with that low moving through the Bering Sea, starting to bring warmer air to the Alaska Peninsula and the southwest coastline, bringing rain to those areas, and some rain for the central and western Aleutians as well. Out over mainland Alaska, high pressure is dominating most of the area tonight. There will be some isolated snow showers in northeastern portions of the state. However, south central Alaska will be kept at bay with the higher pressure, and then we will see some rain for Kodiak Island. Down in the Panhandle area, some troughs moving through the area, bringing some rain and extending that warmer air throughout much of the Panhandle. As we move into Tuesday, that rain is going to clear up in southeast with just some isolated showers in southern locations and up by the Yakutat area. Southerly flow from mainland Alaska is going to bring rain to the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, as well as rain into the Bristol Bay area and a rain-snow mix for the YK Delta and up into the Seward Peninsula area. The rest of the interior part of the state and up along the Arctic coastline is going to be kept away from the precipitation with the high pressure over the area, and then low pressure in the southern portions of the Bering Sea, bringing some rain closer towards the Pribilof Islands and some lighter rain to the central and western Aleutians. Then on Wednesday, a new system is going to approach from the North Pacific, bringing more warm air and southerly winds to the western and central Aleutians, bringing rain to those areas. And then a weaker trough moving through the eastern portions of the Bering, bringing some rain to the Pribilof Islands and Alaska Peninsula, and some snow to areas further to the north, with a mix of rain and snow for much of the western part of the mainland.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.